Welcome to The Blitz, a podcast from Coram Deo Church. The Blitz is all about tackling tough topics head-on at full speed. Are you ready? Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of the day is that you happen to be checking out this episode. My name is Pastor John, and I will be your host today on The Blitz. Our title for this episode, this podcast, is Piper Biting Keller, oh my. And I'm going to be revisiting some of the questions, concerns that I had and many others had with some statements Piper made going into the presidential elections, as well as some of the stuff that Keller has been tweeting. And my goal is not to just bring these guys down. I want to talk about something that I think is really important as we move forward in this increasingly confusing culture, not just in the world, but also in the church. So bear with me, and we'll see where this goes, okay? So I'm going to begin by talking about a blog that Piper released on Desiring God in late October of, that would be 2020, and it was going right into the presidential election. This was released somewhere around 2 weeks before the election took place. And Piper's trying to, he says he doesn't want to sway anybody. I think Piper should know that he has a lot of influence, and if he says something, he's going to sway people, but he's telling us he doesn't want to sway us, but he's just going to give us his thoughts on the thing. So I'm going to just read some sections of the blog, and then we're gonna try and talk through this and step back and go, what does this mean? Okay, so these are direct quotes from his blog, and if you go back and read it, and I would actually encourage you to read the whole thing. I don't have time to go through all of it, and so to be fair, you should read the whole thing. But I'm gonna read part of it, and in this section I'm gonna read right now, he lists a bunch of Greek words for specific sins. I'm just going to spare you the enunciation of those things. If you go back and look you'll see that in parentheses there are Greek words listed. Okay, so here's what he says. I remain baffled that so many Christians consider the sins of unrepentant sexual immorality, unrepentant boastfulness, unrepentant vulgarity, unrepentant factitiousness, and the like to be only toxic for our nation, while policies that endorse baby-killing, sex-switching, freedom-limiting, and socialistic overreach are viewed as deadly. So here's what he's saying. He goes, I don't understand how people can say Trump's character, right, which Trump clearly has character issues, right? I don't know anybody who was denying that. But anyways, he goes, I can't understand how Christians could consider a character issue to only be toxic nationally, and on the flip side, consider policies, those being the policies of Biden, to be deadly. He goes, I don't understand that distinction. And then he goes on to say, the reason I put those Greek words in parenthesis, right, so each one of those sins, he has the Greek word for it, is to give a graphic reminder that these are sins mentioned in the New Testament. To be more specific, they are sins that destroy people. They are not just deadly, they are deadly forever. They lead to eternal destruction. And he refers to 2 Thessalonians 1:9. And so what he says after that is, my point so far is simply to raise the stakes of what is outwardly modeled in leadership so that Christians are given pause. It is not a small thing to treat lightly a pattern of public behaviors that lead to death. Okay, so here's what he's trying to set up, that there's great concerns about Biden's policies because they are pro-abortion, they are for transgenderism, they are limiting religious freedom, and he acknowledges that there's socialistic overreach. We know that is abundantly true, but he's trying to make a distinction between that, and he goes, is that really as bad as the character issues that Trump has? And then he goes into identify these character issues, giving them their New Testament Greek word, and he's arguing that the character issues, the sins of Trump, they're not just deadly, but they are deadly forever. They lead to eternal destruction. And so you read that and you go, oh yeah, my gosh, that's true. And of course that's true. Yes, the sins that Piper listed, which Trump was clearly guilty of, they lead to death forever. But here's what he seems not able to see, is that the sins of Biden also lead to death forever. All sins lead to death forever. And I don't know how Piper misses that. He makes that assumption, sins lead to death forever, and then he looks at Trump and he applies it just to Trump. He's not willing to look the other way. So it seems as if Piper is either unwilling or unable to acknowledge that while all sins bring condemnation, there is no debate there, right? All sins, doesn't matter what your particular brand of sin is, all sins bring death, but not all sins affect a culture or a nation the same way. So it seems like Piper is considering not the cultural and national effects of policies and attitude. All he's looking at is that sin brings death, and so it's basically we need to look at Trump as bringing death, right? And he's dying because he brought death upon himself through his sin, and so that's worse than abortion, right? And it's really hard to wrap your head around it. All sins bring death. It doesn't matter what sin it is. It doesn't matter who commits that sin. That is true. However, Piper seems unable to acknowledge the fact that not all sins affect a culture or the same way. He seems to be arguing that all sin affects a culture the same way, or even it even seems like he's trying to say the sins of Trump affect a culture worse than, actually he does say this, the policies of Biden. We'll get there in just a second, okay? So we need to just acknowledge, we need to push back and go, all sin leads to death. That is absolutely true. However, not all sin affects people, a community, a culture, a society, or a nation the same way. This is why in the Old Testament, when you have law, right? Not all sin is a crime, and not all crimes are punished equally, right? Sin is sin. Sin brings death, but it doesn't bring, it brings spiritual death in terms of separation from God and condemnation, but it doesn't bring the same judicial weight because not all sin affects people in a culture and a nation in the same way. Let me just put it this way. Is a man who tells lies as dangerous and hurtful and destructive as the man who owns slaves? Okay? Is a man who tells lies as dangerous and hurtful and destructive as a man who owns slaves? Or is the person who covets his neighbor's car as destructive and dangerous as the neighbor who is an abortionist who works at Planned Parenthood? Right? So Piper's logic seems to be saying, well, their sin leads to death, and so it's the same. It is sin, and it does bring condemnation, but it certainly does not affect a community and a culture and a society the same way. If you had to choose, and I've said this before, if you had to choose between the neighbor who had a problem with telling lies and the neighbor who had a problem with committing murder, which one would you want? You say, don't they both bring death? Certainly they both bring death, but one brings a level of destruction into your life that is categorically different than the other. We just acknowledge this. So Piper is arguing that someone's character is at least, and I think he's actually going further than this, it's at least, if not more powerful than their policies. But he seems to miss the point that policies reflect character. These things are not separated. The policy that says children should be murdered in the womb, that should be a legal right. That is a constitutional right that the government should be able to take tax money out of your paycheck to pay for that. That is not just a policy. That is a reflection of character. These things are not separated. So a president who is pro-abortion, who is pro-transgenderism, that president has serious character flaws. He has serious character issues. And how does Piper miss this? I do not know. I remained baffled. But he goes on to say that he himself is baffled. He says, I think it is baffling. This is Piper again. I think it is baffling and presumptuous to assume that pro-abortion policies kill more people than a culture saturating pro-self pride. This statement, I believe to be indefensible. This was one of the statements in the blog that I was like, oh my gosh, what are you saying? Like, it's one thing to say, hey, church, you should be concerned about the character issues of Trump, right? Clearly, that was the case. But here, Piper is saying, I don't understand the person who thinks that pro-abortion policies lead to more loss of life than pro-self-pride. So he's arguing that I think the rational, the clearly thinking person will see that pro-self-pride leads to more death than pro-abortion policies. And I go, really? Is John Piper suggesting that 1 million people are murdered in our country each year because of pro-self-pride? Because that is about how many unborn babies are brutally murdered in the womb each year. It's somewhere around 800,000, and that is the abortions that we know of. And under the Biden administration, abortion is being funded and also defended and demanded in other countries that we provide aid and support to. So if we're just looking at our own country, we're looking at 850,000-ish children being murdered every year. That's a couple 100,000 more lives than was lost in the Civil War, and that number is repeated every single year. So is Piper suggesting that pro-self-pride kills more people than that? And my anticipation is that his pushback would be, well, no, I don't mean that people are actually dying. I mean that there is sin that brings death. There's a death that comes through that. And I can't follow that argument because, again, he is unable or unwilling to have these categories in which we understand all sin leads to death, but not all sin affects others the same way. I have no idea what Piper was thinking. Okay, so that was Piper. That was October, late October of 2020, and then just recently, I want to talk about a tweet that came out in late August from Tim Keller. And it simply said this: Congratulations, Greg, on your appointment. Greg is a friend whom I have debated, and while I don't agree with him on many things, I do wish him well. Now, on the face, you might go, okay, what's so big with that deal? Well, Greg Epstein is the person that Tim Keller is congratulating here, and he was just awarded the seat or position, essentially, of head chaplain at Harvard, and it is no surprise to anybody that Greg is an atheist. Okay, so here you have Tim Keller congratulating his atheist buddy on his appointment to head chaplain at Harvard University. Now, lest you think I'm overreacting, Keller recently had to post an article to defend his comments because so many people were understandably scratching their heads and going, what in the world is Keller saying? So some things you got to understand. Harvard was established in the 1600s by Puritans, and it was intended, like many of the elite education institutions in our country, it was initially founded as a seminary. It was supposed to train pastors, like Puritan Reformed pastors. So this is like, within 100 years of the Protestant Reformation that's taking place in Europe. And here we have the founding of a university meant to train and equip pastors who will teach and preach and lead in local congregations. Okay, so you got to understand that historical context. Harvard was meant to train pastors, and now, and this is no surprise. I mean, unless you've been living under a rock, you know that just about every Christian institution in this country has gone hardcore secular. So the shocker here is not that, oh my gosh, Harvard is going secular. There's no shock there. Nor is there any shock that Harvard decided to appoint an atheist as a chaplain. Just think about that for a moment. What does a chaplain do? What is their job? Chaplains, we usually think of a chaplain as being, a religious, a pastor, a leader in that capacity. If you just go look up the word on the dictionary, you'll find that it's a member of the clergy attached to a private chapel, institution, ship, branch, armed forces, blah, 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 blah. We think of a spiritual advisor. We think of, not just a spiritual advisor, we think of a pastor. We think of a religious leader. And this is a chaplain at Harvard, something that was founded as a seminary to train pastors. So you have all this going on, but we're still not surprised at this point, right? Harvard appointing an atheist chaplain to lead all of the other chaplains in providing spiritual direction and nourishment and care for some of the most privileged students in our country. There's no surprise there. This is the surprise. What is Keller doing? Why is Keller celebrating this? He got a good amount of pushback for his tweet, in which I already said he released another tweet, and there was an article attached to it, and you can read the article. I found it to be very uncompelling, but he got enough pushback to release the article, and it's basically he said in the tweet in which this article was listed, Christians need to recapture how to live in interfaith spaces. And it's just baffling that rather than having concern about the continued decline of what was a historically Christian organization, instead of being concerned about the abandonment of any semblance of Orthodox theology or Christian theology, that this organization has now said our head chaplain, the chaplain of all other chaplains, is an atheist, right? That is something that we should be deeply concerned about. That was something that should break our hearts, and there should be some, I think, also concern from a Christian worldview, a perspective of going, what does it mean for an atheist to guide people spiritually, right? Now, what if a good buddy was named captain of a major airlines and he had never flown a plane before? Would we congratulate that? Would that be something to celebrate? We're like, no, that person's not qualified to do that, and in fact, under their leadership, it's quite certain that it's not going to go well on the plane. That has to be true as someone functioning as a chaplain, as a spiritual leader whose students are coming to seek answers to life and direction and meaning, to know that person is not only not going to tell them the truth, but is going to tell them things that are absolutely false, that lead to death and destruction. How do we celebrate that? I just don't get it. I wonder, how would Keller feel if Redeemer Presbyterian ordained an atheist elder? Would he still be? And maybe that's not a fair comparison, but I'm absolutely baffled, and I know I'm not the only one. It's just absolutely confusing as to what in the world Keller in this tweet is thinking and doing. And so we'll segue to the next thing here. Okay, so if you want more on the atheist chaplain, why it's concerning, the history of Harvard, I would encourage you to go listen to Al Mohler's podcast. It's called The Briefing, and the episode from, I believe, September the 1st. In that episode, Mohler spends some time going into what has happened at Harvard, what is happening, and what it means for us. So go listen to that. I don't have time to get in all the details. What I want to do is I want to just step back and go, Piper has said some things that are very, very concerning and confusing. And Keller has said some things, and increasingly so as of late, and I'm just sharing one example, that are also confusing. And what are we to make of that. A lot of people have asked me, what do you think is motivating these men or other men like them? And the reality is that I don't know. I could speculate. I don't want to do that here, but I want to give some thought and some direction to how we respond to this, okay? So on the one hand, we need to, because an author or a trusted leader says something that we don't understand or that we disagree with severely, it does not mean that everything that leader has said is now to be thrown out. I, like probably many of you and many others, can say, there's things that Piper has written. I've heard sermons where there was stuff that was really helpful. I remember reading The Reason for God, and that ended up kind of turning me towards Van Tillian presuppositional apologetics. There's been certain things that Keller has explained and defined that I can go, those were significant. They were helpful. In fact, just this last Sunday, this lady at church was kind of sharing her testimony, and she was recalling that she met with me at a Starbucks when she was going through a very difficult time, and I recommended a book to her. It was a book by Tim Keller, and when she read the first page, she saw her own sin, her own need for grace, her own need for Christ, and the rest was, the deal was, it was done. And so she became a Christian, got baptized, now is a member of our church. So we don't have to pretend like everything Piper ever said is terrible or everything that Keller ever said is terrible. Okay, so that's the first thing. Okay, so when these leaders say things that are really confusing and frustrating and make no sense, we don't have to then go back and throw out everything they've ever said or everything they've ever written. But on the other side, if you're going to say there's two ditches we can fall into. One ditch is we throw everything out. The other ditch is this, and this is, I will say, this is a bit more concerning to me, and that is that people will fail to think, they'll refuse or fail to think critically about things that Piper and Keller say, because they have said so many helpful things in the past. So Piper or Keller will get a free pass on the things they say that seem inconsistent or confusing or contradictory. We're not going to talk about those things or discuss or explore those things at all. Why? Because, Piper said some really great helpful things, or Keller said some really great helpful things, or wrote some things or whatever in the past. And so we're just not going to critique them. And I have a real concern that there's a lot of people that are falling into that ditch. All right, a lot of people who don't want to push back on some of the things that are being tweeted or said or being shared from not just Piper or Keller or any other large trusted voice in the North American church. They don't want to question any of it because these guys in the past have said things that have been, impactful and helpful and clarifying. And here's the thing that I think we need to come to terms with. Last names don't matter. Okay? The fact that somebody's last name is Piper does not mean that he's untouchable or that he is beyond correction. The fact that somebody's last name is Keller does not mean that everything he says is right and that he never makes a mistake. We need to read authors and hear leaders and pastors and teachers with discerning ears. And we should not assume because somebody's last name is Piper or Keller that everything they say is biblically faithful or helpful. We cannot shut down our critical thinking because of the name of an author or a leader or a teacher or preacher or pastor or whatever. These men, guys, we can so easily slip into idolatry where we just assume that because they said it, it must be true. And one of the ways you know that you're starting to idolize one of these leaders, or that you've put this person on a pedestal, is that you are unable to think critically or to push back on things that they say, right? That's a sign. That should be a sign to you in your own heart that there's something wrong there. You have given this person too much authority in your life if you do not feel free to question and to push back and to be critical of things that they are saying. In fact, they need people to be critical. They need people to push back, because otherwise you get into these very unhealthy, narcissistic, these insulated bubbles where nobody can contradict you, and that is entirely dangerous. Okay, so we need to guard our hearts. We need to be willing to ask questions, and people don't get a free pass because of their last names. That is what I'd want to leave you with. I do not have answers to why Piper said what he said about Biden and Trump, and I remain baffled by Tim Keller's comments. I can say there's things that they have contributed in the past that I am grateful for, but that does not give them a free pass moving forward. As Christians, we need to think biblically, we need to think critically, and that is especially true in this particular moment, because the church right now in our culture is being bombarded with lies and confusion and deception, and we need to discern. In the book of Acts, it talks about the Bereans who were constantly consulting the scriptures. We need to weigh everything according to the standard of the scriptures, and it doesn't matter what a person's name or last name is. We have to think critically with our minds engaged. So I'll leave it with that. I hope that you can think critically. I hope that you can ask questions, that you can consult the scriptures, that you can enjoy the good things that authors contribute to you in your life, that you can be thankful for that, but that you will not give them a free pass, that you will always weigh things according to the standard of the scriptures. All right, that's it for this episode of The Blitz. Until next time, take care.